Call of Duty Modern Warfare usually carries that heavy Activision premium, making a $7 price tag feel like a typo. Even if multiplayer lobbies aren't your usual hangout, the campaign alone justifies giving up a fast food meal for this. Clearing a pitch-black townhouse using night vision goggles remains one of the most tense, meticulously crafted shooter sequences ever made. The weapon animations have a weight to them that ruined other shooters for a lot of people. It demands a massive chunk of hard drive space, but for a 90% discount, getting access to this level of polish is basically a no-brainer. Dead Island 2 was trapped in development hell for a decade, which makes the fact that it actually runs well completely shocking. Dropping $5 on an experience built entirely around Hollywood mansions and wildly excessive violence is an easy call. The procedural flush-tearing system is disgustingly accurate. Hitting a zombie with a pool cue visibly shatters specific bones and tears skin exactly where the impact happens. The story isn't going to win any writing awards, and the humor rarely lands, but strapping a car battery to a machete and turning a pool party into a hazard zone never stops being entertaining. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt fundamentally broke the scale for how much content a single game should have. Picking this up for under $4 feels slightly illegal considering players routinely clock over 200 hours on a single save file. Entire side quests involving haunted frying pans or drunken vampires have better writing than most full-priced releases. Combat movement can feel a little floaty until you get the rhythm down, but the sheer density of this world makes up for it. Getting lost in a grim, politically charged fantasy continent is easily the best value you'll find during this entire event. Assetto Corsa Competizione demands respect the second you sit behind the wheel. Sim racing can be a terrifyingly expensive hobby, so grabbing arguably the most accurate GT3 simulation ever built for $4 is wild. The tire physics model is so unforgivingly realistic that you can actually feel the difference in grip when track temperatures drop a few degrees. Attempting to keep a Porsche 911 straight during a midnight downpour will make your hands sweat. Playing on a keyboard is essentially impossible, but if you own even a cheap force feedback wheel, this will instantly consume your evenings. The Forest understands psychological horror better than most games entirely dedicated to the genre. Crashing on an island and building a log cabin sounds relaxing until you notice a pale figure silently watching you from the tree line. The enemy AI is famously erratic. Sometimes they attack in force, and other times they just stalk you from a distance, testing your defenses and trying to figure out your sleeping schedule. Convincing a friend to spend barely $4 to experience pure paranoia while frantically chopping down trees in the pitch black is exactly what co-op gaming was made for. Ghost of Tsushima executes the samurai cinematic fantasy flawlessly. Even at $36, the sheer visual direction makes it a smart investment. Instead of cluttering your screen with mini-maps and compass markers, the game literally uses the wind to guide you through burning villages and massive bamboo forests. Wiping the blood off your katana after perfectly parrying 3 Mongols in a mud-soaked duel never loses that movie-like impact. The stealth mechanics are incredibly basic, but when the swordplay feels this heavy and responsive, quietly sneaking around usually takes a back seat to challenging entire camps to a frontal assault. A Plague Tale: Innocence takes a very simple light and dark mechanic and turns it into pure nightmare fuel. Seeing it drop to $4 is the perfect excuse to experience a truly miserable medieval France. The star of the show isn't the stealth or the crafting, it's the rendering technology capable of putting thousands of squealing, flesh-eating rats on screen at once. Throwing a rock to break an enemy's lantern, instantly condemning them to be swallowed by a tidal wave of rodents is brutal. It's heavily linear, but that focused pacing keeps the tension tightly wound from start to finish. The Quarry is essentially an interactive summer camp slasher movie where your mistakes get teenagers permanently killed. Throwing down $6 for a branching narrative with graphics this realistic is a solid alternative to a movie ticket. The facial animations are so heavily detailed that you can usually read when a character is lying just by their eye movements. Making snap decisions while trying to figure out who to trust inevitably leads to someone getting a shotgun blast to the chest by accident. Having friends shout contradictory advice at you from the couch is the ideal way to survive the night. Dead Space defined modern survival horror, and seeing the complete ground-up remake sitting at $6 feels like a glitch in the store. The sound design alone justifies the purchase. Walking through the abandoned USG Ishimura while listening to heavy metal boots clank against the floor grates, knowing every ventilation shaft is a potential threat, keeps your heart rate spiked. The strategic dismemberment system forces you to stay perfectly calm while aiming for limbs, even when a necromorph is sprinting at your face. It's an exhausting, terrifying, perfectly paced masterpiece that respects your time and your nerves. Ghostwire Tokyo puts a totally bizarre spin on the standard open-world formula. Walking through a rain-slicked, hyper-detailed recreation of Tokyo where the entire population is vanished sets a seriously lonely mood. Instead of guns, your hands shoot elemental magic using incredibly fluid, fast-paced finger-weaving animations that look like they were pulled straight from an anime fight scene. The open-world activities can get a bit repetitive after a dozen hours, but spending $6 just to explore a haunted Shibuya and feed stray dogs while ripping the cores out of Slenderman lookalikes is absolutely worth it. Baldur's Gate 3 ruined role-playing games for a lot of people by raising the standard impossibly high. Grabbing it at a discount, even a smaller one, guarantees your social life will evaporate. The sheer volume of variables the engine tracks is staggering. You can bypass a heavily guarded fortress by stacking crates, turning into a cat, and sneaking through a tiny hole in the roof, and the characters will actually comment on your weird choices. The inventory management can get incredibly messy, but having a world that organically reacts to your absolute worst ideas is a rare privilege. Warhammer 40,000 Darktide nails the desperate, dirty feeling of surviving against impossible odds. Dropping a $10 bill to team up with 3 friends and purge a sprawling hive city is a phenomenal deal. Developer Farshark has heavily overhauled the progression system since launch, making the class building highly addictive. The real draw is the melee combat. Revving up a chainsaw and cleaving through a dozen plague zombies delivers an auditory crunch that never gets old. The matchmaking can be a bit chaotic with randoms, but surviving a frenzied horde with a sliver of health leaves you buzzing with adrenaline. Stellar Blade brings a heavy-action RPG mechanics into a gorgeous Wild-Est wasteland. Catching a recent release dropping into the $40 range makes jumping in highly tempting. The combat sits perfectly between fast-paced character action and heavy, deliberate parry timing. Learning an aggressive boss's action pattern and deflecting a 10-hit combo without taking a scratch triggers an incredibly satisfying audio cue. Platforming sections can occasionally feel a little stiff during the main campaign, but the core loop of unlocking absurdly flashy skills and tearing through grotesque biomechanical monsters remains razor-sharp from start to finish. Red Dead Redemption 2 operates on a level of obsessive detail that most studios would never attempt. Snagging Arthur Morgan's story for $15 provides more hours of premium entertainment than most streaming subscriptions. The world feels completely indifferent to your existence. NPCs maintain daily routines, mud physically cakes onto your boots, and firing a gun in a tight canyon creates a realistic echo. The slow, deliberate pacing isn't for everyone, but eventually that heavy rhythm pulls you into the most convincing digital frontier ever built. Grand Theft Auto V refuses to fade away, and the Enhanced Edition proves exactly why this map remains a permanent fixture on hard drives. If you somehow haven't grabbed this yet, $15 is the sweet spot. The single-player campaign holds up beautifully, but the real longevity comes from the PC ecosystem. Jumping into heavily modded roleplay servers or downloading custom scripts that turn the city into a chaotic physics playground keeps things endlessly entertaining. It takes ages to load into online sessions, but the sheer sandbox freedom guarantees you'll get your money's worth. God of War Ragnarök expands on the Norse apocalypse with an absurd amount of cinematic weight. Seeing a massive PlayStation heavy hitter get a price cut makes it incredibly hard to ignore. The Leviathan axe remains the most satisfying weapon in gaming history. Throwing it into a raider's chest and snapping it back to your hand with a heavy thud delivers an immense feeling of power. The puzzle sections can sometimes feel like speed bumps during the main campaign, but tearing through mythological gods with bare fists while watching Kratos struggle with fatherhood is an absolute masterclass in pacing. Marvel's Spider-Man 2 takes the momentum of the original game and straps a rocket to it. Dropping below $50 makes swinging through New York an easy addition to the backlog. The inclusion of the web wings completely changes how you navigate the city. Catching a slipstream and gliding across the river at terrifying speeds feels incredibly smooth. Switching instantly between Peter and Miles with almost zero loading screens is a technical marvel. The side activities occasionally dip into generic territory, but the sheer joy of the momentum keeps you firmly hooked to the controller. Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice actively demands perfection, and grabbing the GTOI edition at half price is the perfect way to test your patience. Unlike other From Software titles, you cannot grind your way out of a problem or hide behind a massive shield. The posture system forces you to stand your ground, clash swords, and learn the exact rhythm of every single fight. Surviving a multi-phase boss fight with a sliver of health left gives you an adrenaline rush that very few games can replicate. The learning curve is brutal, but the resulting mastery is intoxicating. Kingdom Come Deliverance II refuses to hold your hand, dropping you into a painstakingly accurate 15th century Bohemia. Catching a massive 60% discount on a sequel this ambitious is rare. Everything requires effort. Swinging a sword feels heavy and clumsy until you actually put in the time to train your character's muscles. Even reading a book is impossible until you learn the alphabet. It definitely has a layer of Euro jank, and managing hunger mechanics can be tedious, but fully immersing yourself in a historical simulator where you start as an absolute peasant is deeply rewarding. Rust is a fascinating social experiment, heavily disguised as a survival game. Spending $20 essentially buys you a ticket to pure, unhinged human psychology. Waking up naked on a beach with a rock and trying to negotiate your survival over proximity chat rarely goes well. You'll spend hours building a stone base, only to log off and realize someone blew off your front door with rockets while you slept. It is punishing, unforgiving, and toxic, but orchestrating a successful raid on a rival compound using scrap weapons generates memories you'll talk about for years. Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine 2 delivers the ultimate unfiltered power fantasy. Securing a heavy 70% discount on an absolute spectacle like this is the exact reason we wait for these sales. The proprietary Swarm engine puts a terrifying number of Tyranids on screen at once, making every defensive stand feel like a hopeless cinematic set piece. Executing a perfect parry to instantly execute a leaping alien provides serious momentum to the heavy, stomping combat. The progression tree is a little thin, but wading waist-deep into a horde of monsters with a heavy bolter is unmatched stress relief. Ready or Not strips away the fast-paced sliding of modern shooters and replaces it with agonizing claustrophobic tension. Grabbing this SWAT simulator at half price is a phenomenal investment if you have patient friends. Checking under a door with an optic wand, stacking up and breaching a room with flashbangs requires intense communication. Rushing a corner blindly will instantly get your entire squad wiped out. The AI suspects are incredibly unpredictable, sometimes surrendering immediately and other times pulling a hidden weapon. It demands serious focus, making every successful arrest feel incredibly earned.
Resident Evil 4. Seeing a top-tier modern remake drop 75% down to $9.99 is frankly ridiculous. Capcom didn't just slap a fresh coat of paint on a classic, they rebuilt the entire tension system from scratch. Your knife parries break, ammo is chronically scarce, and the enemy AI actively tries to flank your blind spots. The pacing here is a masterclass in escalating panic. Paying $10 for a campaign that normally costs $40 gives you zero excuses to skip the anxiety-inducing brilliance of the village siege. Divinity Original Sin 2. At $10.66 with that massive 82% discount, you are getting an offensive amount of content. Modern RPGs rarely give you this much absolute freedom to break their own rules. If a boss is too hard, you can literally teleport a 2-ton painting on their head to instantly crush them. The systems constantly interact in chaotic, unintended ways, turning every combat encounter into a mad science experiment. Grabbing an easy 100 hours of playtime for the price of a fast food lunch is the definition of a smart buy. Schedule I. Grabbing this for $11.99 instead of $20 feels entirely justified once the mechanics get their hooks into your brain. The simulation doesn't pull any punches, forcing brutal choices where managing risk directly correlates with staying afloat. Every decision cascades into bigger problems down the line, requiring a level of aggressive foresight most management games never ask of you. The steep learning curve filters out impatient players quickly, but those who stick around find a deeply obsessive loop that justifies entirely abandoning your sleep schedule. Hollow Knight. Snagging this masterpiece for $7.49 is a no-brainer. The platforming is razor-sharp, but the real obsession comes from getting hopelessly lost in a decaying underground society and slowly piecing the map together. You will get crushed by bosses, you will lose your currency, and you will immediately run back to try again because the combat feels that flawless. The map design practically begs you to sequence break and explore areas way earlier than intended. It sets an impossible standard for the entire Metroidvania genre. Deep Rock Galactic. Dropping from $30 down to $8.99 makes this the ultimate co-op steal of the sale. Forget clean tactical shooters. Here, you're a severely underpaid dwarf aggressively strip mining a hostile alien planet while heavily intoxicated. The fully destructible caves mean you can drill a completely custom escape route right through the core of the map when a swarm hits. The community is famously welcoming, and throwing a flare into a pitch-black cavern to reveal 100 screeching bugs crawling on the ceiling never stops being terrifying. Hogwarts Legacy. Warner Brothers slashing 85% off the price to bring this down to $8.99 is the most aggressive deal on the entire storefront. Paying less than $10 to fly a broom around a fully realized 1800s wizarding world is staggering value. The spell combos allow for surprisingly brutal combat mechanics, where you can launch enemies into the air, freeze them, and casually blast them off a cliff. The castle alone holds enough secrets to justify the price tag entirely. The Outlast Trials. Getting this for $11.99 is perfect if you want to actively ruin your friendships through sheer panic. Taking the extreme, helpless horror of the original games and turning it into a twisted co-op escape room works surprisingly well. The sound design guarantees you will be screaming into your microphone while your teammates completely abandon you in a pitch-black hallway. The game thrives on communication breaking down under pressure, creating those hilarious, desperate moments where everyone is just scrambling for the exit. Star Wars Battlefront II. 75% drop to $9.99 makes pulling the trigger on this massive shooter incredibly easy. Forget the chaotic launch controversy. Years of relentless updates turned this into the definitive massive-scale Star Wars combat simulator. Hearing the iconic thermal imploder sound echo across a chaotic 40-player battlefield hits differently. The sheer variety of eras, vehicles, and heroes available now means you can seamlessly transition from a gritty infantry mudfight into an overwhelming orbital space battle. 9 Souls. Slashing the price in half to $14.99 turns an already great action game into an immediate purchase. Applying intense rhythm-based Sekiro-style deflection mechanics to a beautifully hand-drawn 2D world creates a brutally punishing combat loop. Mashing the attack button gets you killed instantly. You have to memorize enemy patterns and deflect strikes with absolute precision to survive. The satisfaction of finally breaking a boss's posture after dying a dozen times provides an adrenaline spike very few side-scrollers can replicate. Age of Mythology Retold. Picking up this modernized classic for $15.99 is a phenomenal use of your Steam wallet. The developers brilliantly preserved the chaotic energy of dropping literal god powers onto an RTS battlefield while smoothing out the ancient interface issues. Raining down a lightning storm on an opposing army while a massive titan casually walks through their base remains immensely satisfying. It strikes a perfect balance between competitive strategy and the sheer ridiculous fun of pitting minotaurs against mummies. Hollow Knight Silksong. Finding this discounted to $14.99 at 25% off feels surreal after the agonizingly long wait. Playing as Hornet entirely shifts the momentum of combat. She's faster, more aggressive, and relies on a fluid acrobatic toolset that makes the original game feel slow by comparison. The new environments are incredibly dense, hiding bizarre secrets and punishing platforming challenges behind every breakable wall. The movement mechanics alone allow for an absurd level of aerial freedom. Sea of Thieves. Dropping to $13.99 makes this the perfect excuse to finally bully your friends into forming a pirate crew. The water physics are arguably the best in gaming history, but the real magic is the entirely unscripted player interactions. A simple voyage to dig up a chest can instantly turn into a 3-way naval battle featuring a kraken attack and a stolen rowboat escape. It thrives on absolute chaos, forcing you to manually manage the sails, steer, and desperately bucket water to survive.
Half-Life Alyx. If you own a VR headset, ignoring a $14.99 price tag on this is practically a crime. The level of physical interaction is unmatched. You're not just pressing a reload button, you're frantically digging through your virtual pockets for ammo while a headcrab lunges at your face. The gravity gloves allow you to effortlessly flick items across the room into your waiting hands, ruining how every other VR game feels for the rest of your life. Dead Cells. For $12.49, you are getting one of the tightest, most responsive action games ever coded. The weapon variety is staggering, allowing you to tape together completely unhinged builds like dual-wielding frying pans that crit frozen enemies. Death is constant, but the progression loop is so brilliantly designed that restarting a run never feels like a punishment. You keep pushing just to see what deeply unfair combination of modifiers you can unleash on the next boss. Hell Let Loose. Paying $12.49 for this level of tactical PTSD is an absolute bargain. This isn't an arcade shooter where you run around racking up kill streaks. You'll die instantly from a bullet fired 3 fields away if you don't communicate. A single properly placed machine gunner can hold off an entire squad, and the proximity voice chat turns every trench assault into a gritty cinematic nightmare. The sheer scale of 50 versus 50 coordination is genuinely intimidating. Hades. Seeing this masterpiece sitting at $6.24 is the kind of discount that makes you double-check your screen. It completely revolutionized the roguelike genre by actually rewarding your deaths with incredibly well-written narrative progression. Every failed escape attempt unravels more dialogue, deeper relationships, and fresh weapon aspects that completely alter how you approach combat. The way different god boons stack together allow you to organically discover screen-clearing combos that feel completely illegal. Valheim. Getting this massive survival sandbox for $9.99 is absurd considering the sheer volume of content packed inside. The building system completely ignores generic snap-to-grid limitations, forcing you to actually calculate structural integrity and ventilation so your campfire doesn't suffocate you indoors. The feeling of finally constructing a massive longship and sailing into an uncharted ocean storm with your terrified friends is unparalleled. It perfectly captures the hostile, beautiful atmosphere of a harsh mythological wilderness. Monster Hunter World. At $7.78, this is easily the highest hours per dollar ratio on the entire list. You track massive, incredibly detailed apex predators through lush ecosystems that feel genuinely alive. The real hook is the deeply satisfying loop of killing a terrifying beast just to turn its skull into a new pair of pants. Each of the 14 weapon types handles so uniquely that swapping from a giant hammer to an insect glaive feels like launching a completely different video game. Dragon Ball FighterZ. Snagging this for $9.69 gives you access to the most visually stunning fighting game ever produced. The developers managed to mimic the 2D anime style while running incredibly fast-paced 3v3 tag team brawls. Even if you're not a hardcore fighting game veteran, the auto-combo systems let you pull off spectacular, screen-shattering cinematic supers within your first 10 minutes. It perfectly captures the sheer, ridiculous kinetic energy of the source material. Sid Meier's Civilization VI. Dropping a massive 90% to hit $5.99 makes this a dangerous purchase for your free time. The addition of district planning fundamentally changes how you expand your empire, forcing you to strategically utilize the terrain rather than just stacking buildings in a single city. The constant balancing act between religion, science, and aggressive military expansion keeps your brain constantly firing. Before you realize it, the sun is coming up and you're still whispering just one more turn.
Detroit Become Human is essentially a playable sci-fi thriller where breathing at the wrong moment feels like it could kill off a main character. The branching narrative here is genuinely absurd. Make one weird choice during a hostage negotiation early on, and an entire chunk of the endgame fundamentally changes. Quantic Dream built a flowchart of consequences so dense that you'll need 3 playthroughs just to see half the script. Seeing a cinematic experience of this budget drop below $4 is just silly. That's less than a bad cup of coffee for a branching narrative that will completely hijack your weekend. Mass Effect Legendary Edition packages an entire space opera trilogy into a single launcher, modernizing a story that defined a generation of RPGs. Carrying the exact same character and all their messy diplomatic mistakes across 3 massive titles is a mechanic nobody has really matched since. Sure, the Mako vehicle sections in the first game still handle like a shopping cart on ice, but the payoff of watching your crew's loyalties evolve over 100+ hours makes up for the jank. Picking up 3 of the most acclaimed sci-fi epics in gaming history for less than $5 feels like a glitch in the storefront. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order takes the punishing rhythm of a Souls-like and coats it in lightsaber burns. Nailing a perfect parry against an Inquisitor before force-pushing a squad of stormtroopers off a ledge captures a specific cinematic fantasy perfectly. The map design can occasionally feel like a confusing maze of backtracking, but the sheer visceral weight of the melee combat carries the experience. When you realize Respawn Entertainment's single-player epic is sitting at essentially $4, hesitating barely makes sense. It perfectly scratches that itch for a demanding, heavy-hitting action game where every combat encounter feels dangerous. Devil May Cry 5 aggressively demands that you look as cool as physically possible. Scraping by with a victory means nothing if you didn't do it while taunting a boss in mid-air. The combat engine is terrifyingly deep, allowing players to juggle enemies for actual minutes without touching the ground once the muscle memory clicks. Getting access to an action engine this finely tuned for around $4.50 is an absolute no-brainer. Fighting through hordes of demons to a dynamic heavy metal soundtrack that gets louder the better you play never gets old. Disco Elysium: The Final Cut completely discards combat in favor of arguing with your own shattered psyche. Waking up with a hangover so violent it induces amnesia, players stumble through a surreal murder investigation where failing a dice roll often leads to infinitely more entertaining situations than succeeding. Your necktie might suddenly be giving you terrible life advice, or you might genuinely die from trying to grab a ceiling fan. Grabbing a narrative masterpiece with this much reactive writing for $4 is wild. It will make you laugh out loud and question your political compass in the exact same hour. Dead by Daylight runs on pure adrenaline and paranoia. The asymmetric loop of 4 desperate survivors trying to outsmart one superpowered killer generates an endless supply of unscripted horror movie moments. One match, you're flawlessly looping a killer around a shack, and the next, you're accidentally leading Michael Myers directly into your terrified friends. The initial learning curve can definitely feel a bit punishing against veteran killers, but the chaotic fun with friends is unmatched. Paying $8 for a multiplayer ecosystem that regularly mashes up every major horror franchise in existence gives you ridiculous long-term cooperative value. Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade somehow manages to rebuild a nostalgia powerhouse without ruining the memories. The combat system effortlessly blends real-time action with tactical menu commands, forcing aggressive strategy during boss fights that can easily push 15 minutes of pure spectacle. Midgar feels incredibly dense, even if some of the side quests drag the pacing down a little. But seeing Square Enix's massive visual overhaul drop to $14 is the exact excuse to pull the trigger. Pushing through those final chapters and watching the timeline completely derail is an experience that begs to be played. Horizon Forbidden West demands precision under extreme pressure. Tearing specific armor plating off a metallic T-Rex while dodging laser fire requires a frantic, satisfying type of tactical archery. The sheer scale of the environments can definitely induce a bit of open-world fatigue if you try to clear every single map marker, but the core loop of hunting larger and more aggressive machines is flawless. At half price, dumping 50 hours into a sandbox where you're constantly upgrading gear by dismantling robotic megafauna piece by piece feels like an incredibly smart investment for anyone craving a massive blockbuster. Borderlands 4 doubles down on the sheer mathematical chaos of its loot system. The guns here generate with such wild combinations that finding a shotgun that shoots homing, brain-sucking lasers feels completely normal by hour 10. While the writing might lean a bit heavily on frantic internet humor, the actual shooting mechanics and build variety have never felt punchier. Snagging a major high-octane co-op shooter at a 50% discount while the player base is absolutely packed is just good timing. Sinking dozens of hours into finding the perfect absurd weapon combination with 3 friends remains an unbeatable weekend killer.
The Last of Us Part 1 treats every single bullet like a luxury item, scavenging through a ruined, terrifyingly silent museum knowing you only have 3 revolver rounds and a half-broken brick ratchets up the tension to an agonizing levels. The PC port had a notoriously rough launch, but after extensive patching, the raw emotional weight of this survival horror masterpiece shines through. Securing this kind of prestige cinematic storytelling for $30 makes complete sense. Sneaking past a horde of infected when you're completely out of resources delivers a very specific type of suffocating relief. Crusader Kings III is less of a grand strategy title and more of a medieval soap opera generator. Forget mapping the map. The real strategy is figuring out how to inherit France by marrying off your eccentric cousin to a duke who accidentally falls off a balcony. The interface is undeniably intimidating at first, but once the chaotic logic clicks, the stories are incredible. Seeing this feudal drama engine marked down to $15 is dangerously cheap for a title that routinely eats entire weekends. You'll log off realizing you just spent 4 hours orchestrating a revenge plot over a stolen artifact. XCOM 2 thrives on absolute tactical misery and triumphant comebacks. Commanding a guerrilla resistance force means constantly operating at a disadvantage, where one missed sniper shot can lead to the permanent death of a soldier you spent 20 hours customizing. The sheer panic of a simple extraction mission spiraling out of control is a feeling Firaxis perfected. Yes, missing a 95% hit chance is infuriating, but it makes the flawless operations feel earned. Dropping $3 on a strategy title with limitless replayability and a massive modding scene is honestly one of the highest value propositions on the entire platform. NBA 2K26 translates the momentum of professional basketball into a terrifyingly realistic simulation. Getting the timing down on a heavily contested jump shot or threading a bounce pass through traffic requires actual rhythm and court awareness. It's no secret that the microtransaction menus can feel aggressive if you're trying to max out a career player quickly. However, finding the latest entry in this massive sports franchise sitting under $10 completely changes the math. Grabbing friends for a few casual games and franchise mode delivers endless competitive trash talk without breaking the bank. Euro Truck Simulator 2 sounds incredibly boring on paper until you actually sit in the digital cab, delivering frozen goods from Berlin to Prague while listening to a real-world German radio station is weirdly hypnotic. The physics demand respect, especially when trying to reverse a double trailer in a tight depot during a thunderstorm. For $5, this isn't just a driving game, it's an interactive meditation app. The community around this title has spent thousands of hours hauling cargo simply because the rhythm of the open road is the perfect way to decompress after a terrible workday. Risk of Rain 2 is an exercise in pushing a game's engine to its absolute breaking point. The roguelike scaling dictates that the longer you survive, the harder the enemies hit, forcing you to sprint through stages collecting ridiculous stacks of items. By minute 40, you're not really playing a shooter anymore. You're operating a walking natural disaster fueled by 50 rusty knives and a dozen energy drinks. Catching this much cooperative insanity for a little over $8 is a massive steal. Trying to decipher the screen during a late-game boss fight is a beautiful, chaotic nightmare. Sons of Forest merges peaceful cabin construction with unrelenting psychological terror. Spending 2 hours building a beautiful lakeside retreat is instantly ruined when you hear the screech of a mutated cannibal sprinting through the brush. The AI of the hostile islanders is deeply unsettling, as they'll often just stand in the tree line watching you before deciding to attack. The physics-based building system occasionally gets a little fussy, but the survival mechanics are incredibly engaging. Scoring this tense cooperative nightmare for under $10 guarantees a weekend of pure, panicked yelling with your friends in the dark. Ark Survival Ascended taps directly into the primal fantasy of riding a heavily armed dinosaur into battle. Surviving the first few hours means hiding from everything that moves, but eventually you're breeding an army of genetic super raptors to raid enemy bases. The engine overhaul makes the harsh environments look phenomenal, even if the optimization still struggles on mid-range hardware. For about $11, the sheer volume of content is staggering. You aren't just buying a survival game, you're buying a second job where you will eventually set an alarm for 3 in the morning to feed a baby T-Rex. Hearts of Iron 4 requires you to manage the entire logistical nightmare of a global conflict. Winning a war here isn't just about moving tanks, it's about making sure your factories have enough rubber to produce the tires for those tanks before the winter hits. The learning curve is notoriously steep and requires genuine patience to crack open, but seeing Paradox's flagship World War II simulator drop down to $10 is the perfect excuse to experience the madness. Successfully pulling off a massive encirclement maneuver after 3 hours of meticulous planning is a dopamine rush strategy fans crave. Monster Hunter Wilds makes every single boss fight feel like an exhausting, spectacular marathon. Tracking a massive beast across a dynamic ecosystem before engaging in a 30-minute brawl of traps, counters, and desperate dodges is incredibly satisfying. The clunky inventory management of older titles is mostly smoothed out, letting you focus on mastering the absurdly deep weapon combinations. Seeing a massive current-gen hunting experience drop below $30 is surprisingly tempting. Landing a perfectly timed final blow with a hammer the size of a minivan gives a feeling of triumph that very few action titles can replicate.
Mount and Blade 2 Bannerlord drops you onto a medieval battlefield with zero safety nets. You go from swinging a rusty sword at looters to commanding a massive army of cavalry, actively directing formations while fighting on the front lines. The political simulation side can sometimes feel a bit hollow, but the raw scale of the sieges is completely unmatched. Grabbing this hybrid sandbox for $20 is an insanely good value. Watching 100 heavy cavalry crest a hill and absolutely shatter an enemy flank right when you needed it is a cinematic rush created entirely by the simulation. Total War Warhammer 3 lets you orchestrate the kind of epic fantasy clashes usually reserved for multi-million-dollar movie budgets. Zooming in to watch a giant charging scatter a front line of terrified halberdiers never loses its charm. The Grand Campaign map is incredibly demanding, requiring tight economic management alongside the real-time bloodbaths. At under $9, acquiring an incredibly dense strategy sandbox packed with wildly different asymmetrical factions is a ridiculously smart play. You could easily lose 80 hours just learning the mechanics of a single demonic faction before even touching the rest of the roster. Far Cry 6 embraces the absolute absurdity of guerrilla warfare. Strapping a jury-rigged rocket launcher to your back and sending an attack crocodile into an enemy checkpoint delivers a very specific brand of explosive sandbox chaos. Yes, the open-world formula here is undeniably familiar, relying on the same outpost clearing loop the franchise is known for, but nabbing this massive tropical playground for $15 completely recontextualizes the value. When you just want to shut your brain off, grab a friend and co-op, and blow up a heavily guarded military base with a CD-launching crossbow, this absolutely delivers. MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries makes you feel the punishing weight of piloting a walking tank, managing your heat sinks while trying to surgically blow off the weapons of an enemy chassis requires methodical, heavy-hitting precision. The mercenary management layer, where fixing a blown-off arm forces you to take on risky contracts just to make payroll, adds brutal stakes to every mission. Seeing this dense, stompy simulator available for under $8 is fantastic. Tearing through a destructible city in a 90-ton machine of war while desperately trying to keep your lance alive is an incredible power fantasy that punishes sloppy execution.
Remnant II. A massive 75% price cut down to $12.49 is a genuinely shocking deal for an experience this substantial. Taking the punishing dodge roll mechanics of a Souls-like and handing you heavy firearms completely rewrites the combat pacing. The crazy hook is the procedural generation. The engine physically stitches together completely different worlds, bosses, and quest lines for every run. Your friend's playthrough will feature entirely different secrets and weapons than yours, making the co-op wildly unpredictable and forcing you to constantly adapt to unseen horrors.
Metro Last Light Redux.
Grabbing one of the most atmospheric post-apocalyptic shooters ever made for 99 cents is honestly absurd. A 95% discount means this costs less than a gas station candy bar. The survival mechanics here refuse to hold your hand. You physically have to wipe mud and blood off your visor to see, and military-grade bullets literally act as your currency. You constantly have to decide between buying upgrades or firing your money at mutants in a panic. Grabbing this for under $1 secures a terrifying weekend underground. The Elder Scrolls Volume 5 Skyrim Special Edition. Seeing this drop to $9.99 is the perfect excuse to buy it for the third time, purely for the mods. Bethesda's legendary sandbox remains a brilliant, occasionally janky playground where you can completely ignore the main quest to become a cheese-hoarding vampire. The base game is massive, but the community has effectively built entirely new titles inside the engine. $10 gives you access to a decade's worth of free fan-made expansions that will completely consume your hard drive. Train Sim World 6, dropping from $50 down to $9.99, turns a hyper-niche simulation into an incredibly tempting impulse buy. Operating a 4,000-ton freight locomotive sounds like a chore until you actually memorize the startup sequence and feel the sheer momentum of hauling cargo across a pass. It creates a bizarrely zen flow state. The learning curve is absolutely brutal at first, but once you figure out how to brake without derailing, hauling steel through a blizzard becomes the most relaxing thing in your Steam library. Subnautica Below Zero. Catching a 75% discount brings this freezing underwater nightmare down to $7.49, which is practically stealing. The genius here is how it masks an intense horror experience inside a vibrant survival crafter. Constructing a cozy underwater base feels incredibly rewarding until you built it next to a predator that can swallow your submarine whole. The temperature mechanics add a constant layer of stress above the surface, forcing you to dive back into the terrifying depths just to stay warm. It Takes Two. Dropping to $11.99 makes this the smartest co-op investment on the entire storefront. The craziest part of this deal is the Friends Pass system. You only need to buy one copy, and your partner plays entirely for free. The mechanics change drastically every single level. One minute you're fighting a militarized squirrel on top of a flying plane, the next you're navigating a massive toy box using magnets. It completely refuses to let you get bored, demanding constant communication to survive the sheer absurdity. Cult of the Lamb. Seeing this sliced in half to $12.49 offers staggering value for anyone who secretly wants to run an adorable dictatorship. The contrast between tending a cute village farm and aggressively sacrificing your loyal followers to dark gods never stops being hilarious. The dungeon crawling is fast and fluid, but you will obsess over base management, desperately trying to keep your animal cultists fed so they don't rebel. It perfectly captures that terrifying spiral of realizing you actually enjoy brainwashing woodland creatures. Raft. Scoring this for $13.39 is the perfect excuse to rope your friends into oceanic survival. The premise of starting on 4 tiny pieces of wood with nothing but a plastic hook creates an incredibly satisfying progression curve. You slowly build a sprawling, multi-level floating fortress purely by dragging literal trash out of the ocean. The constant paranoia of a shark silently chewing on your living room floor keeps the tension high, forcing your crew into a frantic panic every time you drop anchor at a deserted island. Subnautica. Dropping to $7.49 makes picking up the original oceanic masterpiece an absolute necessity. Very few titles manage to induce genuine thalassophobia quite like this one. Upgrading your diving gear allows you to push deeper into pitch-black trenches, completely severing your connection to the safety of sunlight. The sound design is actively malicious. Hearing a distant metallic roar echo through the water while your oxygen runs low is paralyzing. Securing this atmospheric panic attack for the cost of a coffee is a brilliant move. Age of Empires 4 Anniversary Edition. Picking up a top-tier modern RTS for $13.99 feels incredibly rewarding. The developers nailed the nostalgic rush of commanding massive medieval armies while smoothing out the clunky interfaces of the past. The asymmetric civilizations actually play completely differently. The Mongols can literally pack up their entire base and move it across the map to ambush your economy.
Coordinating a multi-pronged siege with massive trebuchets remains deeply satisfying, especially when you manage to crack open a heavily fortified stronghold after a grueling hour-long standoff. PowerWash Simulator. Grabbing this for $9.99 sounds like a joke purchase until you accidentally play it until 3 in the morning. Stripping layers of caked-on filth off a massive playground with a high-pressure nozzle triggers something deeply satisfying in the human brain. There's zero combat, zero rush, and zero stress. You just meticulously clean every single inch of a vehicle while listening to a podcast. It exploits your desire for completionism so aggressively that you will refuse to log off until that final tiny speck of dirt is eradicated. Outer Wilds. For $15.99, you are buying the greatest mystery box in gaming history. The progression here isn't tied to unlocking new gear or leveling up stats. Your only currency is pure knowledge. You're trapped in a 22-minute time loop, aggressively exploring a miniature solar system before the sun explodes. Finding a piece of lore on a crumbling planet directly teaches you how to bypass a massive quantum puzzle on the other side of the galaxy. It completely redefines how exploration should work, giving you an ending you will think about for years. Doom Eternal. Seeing this chaotic masterpiece drop to $9.89 makes it a mandatory pickup. This is not a mindless shooter. It demands a violent, high-speed flow state where you treat demons as literal resource piñatas. If you need health, you perform a glory kill. Need ammo? Cut them in half with a chainsaw. The movement tech forces you to constantly dash, grapple, and jump across arenas, turning every encounter into an absolute adrenaline-fueled combat puzzle. Paying less than $10 to rip and tear through hell is an absolute bargain. Stray. Cutting the price in half to $14.99 makes this a brilliant weekend playthrough. The perspective shift is genius. Navigating a grimy, neon-lit dystopia as a completely normal cat completely alters how you view the environment. You're not hacking terminals, you're aggressively meowing to annoy security drones and intentionally knocking paint cans off ledges just to be a jerk. The environmental storytelling is incredibly dense, rewarding players who carefully climb air conditioners to find hidden pockets of life in a deeply lonely metallic city. Blasphemous. Dropping to $7.49 secures you one of the most visually disturbing Metroidvanias on the market. The developers leaned entirely into grotesque, religious-inspired pixel art, creating bosses that are genuinely unsettling to look at. The combat is brutally precise, forcing you to master 3 distinct weapons that also double as exploration tools. Swapping mid-air from a slow, heavy mace to dual rapiers to string together a massive combo feels incredibly responsive. The sheer difficulty will test your patience, but executing a flawless boss run feels like absolute victory. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Trilogy. Grabbing 3 massive visual novels for $9.89 gives you dozens of hours of gripping courtroom drama. The hook isn't action, it's the sheer thrill of catching a smug witness in a massive lie. Cross-examining testimonies and presenting exactly the right piece of evidence at the final possible second creates an unparalleled dopamine rush. The localization is famously brilliant, filled with genuinely funny banter that quickly pivots into surprisingly dark murder mysteries. You will absolutely catch yourself pointing at your monitor and yelling along with the protagonist. The Planet Crafter. At $11.99, this survival crafter offers a progression system that feels incredibly rewarding. Instead of just building a massive base for yourself, you're actively terraforming an entire hostile world. Pumping oxygen and heat into the atmosphere triggers massive, permanent environmental changes. Watching a dead, red rock slowly develop clouds, rain, and eventually sprawling green forests because of machines you built is deeply satisfying. The sheer scale of physically altering a planet's ecosystem gives you a god-tier sense of accomplishment that typical survival games desperately lack. Call to Arms Gates of Hell Ostfront. Snagging this for $8.74 completely revitalizes the strategy genre. The micromanagement here is beautifully chaotic.
Disco Elysium: The Final Cut.
Paying under $4 for what is arguably the greatest piece of interactive writing ever made feels completely legal. Your character wakes up with a hangover so apocalyptic he forgot his own name, the concept of money, and the fact that he's a detective on a murder case. The sheer lunacy of arguing with your own brain chemistry to solve a crime is incredible. Sure, the pacing can feel slow if you hate reading, but the branching consequences are absurd. You can literally die from turning on a ceiling fan too aggressively. Snagging a 90% discount on a masterpiece that permanently ruins standard RPG dialogue for you is an absolute no-brainer. Grim Dawn. ARPG fans have been quietly obsessing over this dark fantasy meat grinder for years, and seeing it drop to $2 and change is genuinely shocking. Forget picking a single class. Combining two distinct skill trees creates ridiculous synergies, like a heavily armored warlord who throws poisonous lightning. The engine definitely shows its age with some stiff animations, but the loot loop is dangerously addictive. The sheer volume of theory crafting available here usually demands a full-price commitment. Dropping a couple of dollars for hundreds of hours of satisfying monster-shattering progression makes this a mandatory card edition. Esoteric Ebb. CRPG fans starving for more Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition mechanics need to grab this immediately. Playing as a burned-out cleric alongside a goblin sidekick trying to uncover a political conspiracy brings a totally fresh vibe to the genre. Translating tabletop rules into a video game can sometimes create a clunky interface, but the chaotic dice rolls and desperate skill checks create incredible unscripted disasters. Getting a 20% discount on a game that captures the exact feeling of a tabletop campaign going totally off the rails makes it a seriously smart buy for a $20 bill. No rest for the wicked. Moon Studios entirely abandoned their platforming roots to build a brutally punishing action RPG, and the result is gorgeous. The weight of every sword swing and dodge roll requires severe precision. Button mashing will just get your spine snapped by a basic infected peasant. It is still in early access, meaning optimization can sometimes get a bit rough depending on your hardware, but paying under $30 for an experience combining Souls-like tension with an incredibly dense handcrafted world guarantees you're getting in on the ground floor of something massive. Bastion. Supergiant Games never misses, and their debut project still looks and sounds better than most modern releases. Having a dynamic narrator comment on every single action you take, even destroying random barrels for no reason, completely changes the atmosphere. The weapon combinations allow for some seriously chaotic combat styles. It is a shorter experience compared to massive open worlds, but the pacing is flawless. For $3, skipping your morning coffee buys you an emotional powerhouse with an unforgettable soundtrack that will live in your head for years. Desperados III. Real-time tactics games can be incredibly intimidating, but executing a perfectly synchronized ambush on a gang of Wild West outlaws provides a massive rush. Setting up a trap using mind control, a fake doctor, and a massive bear trap just never gets old. The trial and error nature means you'll be mashing the quick load button constantly, which can frustrate impatient players, but getting this level of polished, brain-burning puzzle combat for $10 is ridiculous. It turns you into an evil genius, carefully dismantling entire enemy camps, one unfortunate guard at a time. Cleared Hot. Nostalgia for Desert Strike is real, but picking up enemy vehicles with a giant helicopter magnet and dropping them onto other enemies is universal joy. The physics-based destruction adds a layer of hilarious chaos to tactical rescue missions. Controlling a heavily armed chopper takes a minute to get used to, and the learning curve might result in a few accidental crashes into radio towers. But spending $12 for tight twin-stick action combined with absurd physics comedy is a massive win for your Steam library. Wasteland 3.
Managing a squad of cynical desert rangers trying to survive a frozen apocalypse forces you into wildly uncomfortable moral choices. Solving a hostage situation by accidentally blowing up the hostages and then having the game adapt the story around your incompetence is brilliant design. Co-op multiplayer can occasionally desync, so definitely save often if you play with a friend. Seeing this 80-hour masterclass in reactive storytelling drop under $8 feels like a total glitch in the Matrix. You could replay this 3 times and still miss entire factions. Lost and Found Co. Anyone obsessed with finding tiny details in massive crowds will instantly lose track of time here. Taking a duck goddess and turning her into a magical detective creates a weirdly soothing gameplay loop. Every single corner of these hand-drawn maps is packed with inside jokes and animated chaos. Staring at the screen looking for a specific umbrella might give you slight eye strain after a few hours, but getting a 20% discount on a game that basically weaponizes cozy dopamine hits is a fantastic way to stretch your wallet. Whisper of the House. Trying to solve a mystery while stuck in a deeply unsettling environment changes how you interact with everything. The tension comes from what you can't see just outside your flashlight beam. Point-and-click logic sometimes requires combining completely random items, which can halt your progress if you miss a tiny visual cue. Yet finding genuine horror from a top-down perspective is incredibly rare. Spending $12 for an atmospheric thriller that forces you to constantly check your corners guarantees a highly memorable sweatsuiting weekend. Ericsham: The Stolen Dream. Heavily narrative-focused stealth requires brilliant level design, and this Nordic-inspired city absolutely delivers. Managing a crew of outcasts where a single mistake sets off alarms across the entire district keeps the tension incredibly high. Sometimes character pathing can get a bit confused around tight corners, leading to some frantic escapes. A 30% discount on a game blending high-stakes thievery with gorgeous 1920s aesthetics makes it an easy recommendation. The satisfaction of slipping through an impossible security grid entirely unseen is worth the price of admission alone. Tunic. Playing an adorable fox exploring a colorful world is a total trap. Underneath the cute aesthetic hides a brutally difficult combat system and a puzzle design that genuinely breaks the fourth wall. You collect pages of an old-school instruction booklet written in a totally alien language, deciphering mechanics simply by looking at the scribbled pictures. The difficulty spikes on later bosses are absolutely savage. Half off for a game that literally makes you grab a physical notebook to decipher hidden codes is a massive steal. Pathfinder: Wrath of the Righteous. The sheer scale of turning a ragtag group of adventurers into literal demigods is staggering. You can lead a holy crusade as a golden dragon, or decide to become a walking swarm of locusts that devours the entire map. The kingdom management systems can feel incredibly overwhelming, forcing you to micromanage troops when you just want to kill demons. But acquiring a 150-hour epic campaign with insane mythic path reactivity for $5 is probably the highest hours per dollar value of this entire sale. Dead Estate. Fast, gory, and weirdly charming, this twin-stick roguelike demands lightning-fast reflexes. Trapped in a mansion filled with grotesque monsters, the weapon variety keeps every single run feeling completely psychotic. You might start with a basic pistol and end up firing explosive frogs. The visual clutter gets so intense during boss fights that tracking your own character becomes a major challenge. Throwing $5 at a frantic, highly replayable shooter packed with distinct playable weirdos is a zero-risk investment for pure arcade chaos. Warhammer 40,000 Battle Sector. Capturing the sheer brutality of tabletop Warhammer is hard, but watching a squad of heavy dreadnoughts rip through a Tyranid swarm feels incredible. The momentum system rewards aggressive plays, forcing you to push forward instead of turtling behind cover. The campaign interface definitely feels a little bare bones between the actual firefights. However, securing this much tactical depth for $20 is a massive win for strategy fans. Watching an entire alien flank evaporate under precision plasma fire is deeply satisfying. Timely. Treating time like a video file you can scrub backward and forward entirely rewrites how you approach stealth. If a guard catches you, just drag the timeline back 3 seconds and take a different hallway. Coordinating movements with your psychic cat companion creates incredibly complex, synchronized escapes. The total lack of combat might deter anyone looking for action, but spending $9 for a mind-bending puzzle box that lets you literally edit your own mistakes turns you into a precognitive mastermind.
Cyberknight's Flashpoint. Managing a crew of underground mercenaries in a cyberpunk dystopia means constantly balancing stealth, hacking, and sudden outbursts of extreme violence. Planning a perfect heist only to have a single blown fuse alert a heavily armored security team forces you to adapt instantly. The sheer density of the UI can feel like learning to pilot a commercial jet. Getting a 40% cut on a deeply tactical RPG that lets you pull off elaborate corporate sabotage makes this a seriously sharp acquisition for your roster. Darksiders Genesis. Taking a third-person action franchise and successfully shrinking it down to an isometric perspective sounds like a terrible idea, but the execution is fantastic. Swapping between War's heavy sword strikes and Strife's dual pistol acrobatics keeps the combat flowing perfectly. The platforming sections are occasionally frustrating because judging jump distances from this camera angle is tricky, but dropping $4 and change for a beautifully animated, highly polished demon-slaying adventure with fantastic co-op is completely absurd value. Colony Ship, a post-Earth role-playing game. Generational spaceships usually mean advanced tech, but humanity has devolved into violent factions fighting over rusting life support systems. The social mechanics are wild, allowing you to completely talk your way through heavily guarded facilities without firing a single shot. The combat difficulty is utterly unforgiving, punishing bad positioning with immediate death. Snagging a hardcore, incredibly reactive sci-fi RPG for $16 gives you a wildly deep world where your choices genuinely alter the survival of the entire ship. The Thaumaturge. Exploring 1905 Warsaw while controlling ethereal demons to manipulate people's emotions is an insanely specific and brilliant concept. Using esoteric flaws to read minds and force political outcomes creates a wildly different type of detective game. The combat animations can feel a little stiff during massive brawls, taking away some of the impact, but securing a deeply unique historical mystery with a heavy emphasis on psychological manipulation for $12 guarantees an experience you simply cannot find anywhere else.